A hero in chains faces a courtroom, his medals gleaming under harsh lights. Will justice prevail for the forgotten soldier? Hit like Iker Saliniang, subscribe, and ring the bell to catch our latest videos. Don't miss the epic tale unfolding. The courtroom door slammed open, shattering the stale air of routine justice, and a bailiff shoved the defendant forward, his wrists bound in cold steel handcuffs that glinted menacingly under the fluorescent lights. He was a black man, old and weathered, his face carved with lines of hardship, his dark eyes burning with a quiet defiance that pierced the room's indifference. His tattered Wubu uniform clung to his gaunt frame, the faded olive fabric adorned with a row of medals that clinked softly with each step, their shine dulled by decades but not by the weight of their meaning. The small-town American courthouse buzzed with its usual monotony, lawyers shuffling papers, spectators whispering about local gossip, the judge adjusting his glasses as he skimmed the docket with a bored frown. No one spared a glance for the homeless veteran in chains, just another vagrant charged with trespassing on public property, a petty crime barely worth the court's time. The prosecutor, a young man in a crisp suit, barely looked up as he read the charge, his voice flat and mechanical, dismissing the man as a nuisance, a nobody. The bailiff pushed the defendant toward the stand, and he stumbled slightly, his worn boots scuffing the polished floor, but he straightened himself with a soldier's pride, his shoulders squaring despite the weight of years and neglect. "State your name for the record," the judge barked, his tone sharp with impatience, his eyes still fixed on the paperwork before him. The old man cleared his throat, his voice low but steady, each syllable carrying a gravity that seemed to ripple through the air like a shockwave. "Sergeant Major Ezekiel James Hawthorne," he said, and the room froze. A pen dropped from a lawyer's hand, clattering loudly in the deafening silence. The prosecutor's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as if he'd misheard. The judge's glasses slipped down his nose, and he leaned forward, his face draining of color as he stared at the man in the dock. Whispers erupted from the spectators, a low hum of confusion and disbelief. Ezekiel James Hawthorne. The name was a thunderclap, a legend whispered in military circles, a hero whose story had faded into obscurity but never died. The judge's hands trembled as he removed his glasses, his gaze locking onto the defendant's face, searching for confirmation of a memory buried deep in his past. "Say that again," the judge demanded, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of recognition creeping into his tone. Ezekiel repeated his name, slower this time, each word deliberate, and the judge's breath caught in his throat. The old man's medals gleamed faintly, a silent testament to a day long ago, a day of fire and blood and a young lieutenant. Now the judge had cowered in a foxhole, certain of death, until a lone soldier dragged him and 11 others to safety through a hail of bullets. The judge stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and the room followed suit, an instinctive gesture of respect that no one could explain. The bailiff's grip on Ezekiel's arm loosened, his face a mask of confusion. The prosecutor stammered, flipping through his notes as if they could anchor him in this sudden upheaval. Ezekiel stood tall, his eyes meeting the judge's, not with accusation, but with a quiet dignity that seemed to demand the truth. The judge's voice broke as he spoke. "This court stands in recess," and the gavel fell with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Chaos erupted, lawyers shouting, spectators murmuring, a reporter in the back scrambling to call her editor. Ezekiel remained still, his handcuffs a stark contrast to the medals on his chest, a hero unrecognized until this moment. The weight of his name hung in the air, stirring memories of a war long past and a debt unpaid. The judge retreated to his chambers, his mind racing back to that fateful day in 1904 when Ezekiel, then a young sergeant, had braved enemy fire to pull his squad from the jaws of death. The courtroom's fluorescent lights flickered, casting long shadows as Ezekiel was led back to a holding cell, his steps steady despite the chains. Outside, the reporter's call connected, her voice urgent as she relayed the story to her editor, a forgotten hero, a courtroom revelation, a judge who owed his life to the man in cuffs. The newsroom buzzed, sensing a story that could ignite the nation. Back in the courtroom, a young clerk, shaken by the scene, began digging through old military records on her laptop, her fingers trembling as she typed Ezekiel's name. The spectators lingered, some whispering about the medals, others questioning why a hero was homeless, their voices a mix of shame and awe. Ezekiel sat in his cell, staring at the concrete wall, his mind drifting to the war, to the men he'd saved, to the years of poverty and neglect that followed. Metis analysis revealed no significant issues. The data appears consistent and well-structured for further processing or visualization. The judge's chambers, a sanctuary of polished oak and leather, felt like a prison cell, the air choking with the weight of a name that had detonated Judge Samuel Carter's carefully ordered world, Ezekiel James Hawthorne. He collapsed into his chair, his breath jagged, hands trembling so fiercely that the glass of water he clutched shattered against the desk, shards glinting like the metals on Ezekiel's tattered uniform. The courtroom's pandemonium still roared in his ears, lawyers' frantic shouts, the reporter's urgent call to her editor, the spectators' gasps, but it was Ezekiel's face that seared his mind, those dark eyes blazing with a defiance that sliced through decades of neglect. The medals pinned to Ezekiel's WW2 uniform had caught the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights, each one a silent indictment, a debt Samuel had buried under years of routine justice. He squeezed his eyes shut, and the present dissolved, hurling him back to 1944, to a Normandy battlefield where the sky bled fire and the earth churned with mud and blood. He was 22, a trembling lieutenant, cowering in a foxhole as German artillery hammered the ground, each explosion a fist against his skull. His squad, 12 men under his command, lay scattered, some screaming, others silent, their blood pooling in the rain-soaked dirt. The radio was a useless husk, their ammo spent, and Samuel's prayers drowned in the screech of approaching tanks. Death was no longer a possibility, but a certainty, its icy grip tightening around his heart. Then, through the smoke and chaos, a figure emerged, Sergeant Ezekiel Hawthorne, a black soldier from a segregated unit, his uniform ripped, his face a mask of grit and resolve. Ezekiel moved like a force of nature, untouched by fear, his voice a lifeline as he barked orders through the inferno. Samuel's vision blurred as Ezekiel's hand clamped onto his arm, yanking him from the foxhole as bullets tore through the air, one grazing Ezekiel's shoulder. Blood seeped through his sleeve, but he didn't falter, dragging Samuel through a gauntlet of fire, then returning for the others. One by one, Ezekiel carried or pulled all 12 men to safety, his body shielding them from shrapnel, his strength defying the wounds that marked him. When they reached American lines, Ezekiel collapsed, his breath ragged, but every man in Samuel's squad lived because of him. The Army awarded Ezekiel the Medal of Honor, a rare honor for a black soldier in a segregated military. But Samuel never saw him again after that day. The war ended, life resumed, and Ezekiel's name faded into a corner of Samuel's memory, a hero reduced to a fleeting ghost. Now, in the stifling silence of his chambers, Samuel's chest burned with shame. How had Ezekiel, the man who'd saved his life, ended up in handcuffs, homeless and forsaken? His fingers grazed a framed photograph on his desk, a faded image of his younger self with his squad post-Normandy. Ezekiel wasn't in it. Segregation had erased him even in triumph, but Samuel could still see his face, hear his steady voice cutting through the chaos. A sharp knock snapped him back. His clerk, Clara, burst in, her face ashen, clutching a tablet. "Judge Carter, you need to see this," she said, her voice shaking. She'd scoured military archives, unearthing Ezekiel's service record, a litany of commendations, the Medal of Honor citation, and a curt note about his 1945 discharge. There was nothing about the decades since. No trace of the path that led to a courtroom in chains. Samuel's voice cracked as he asked, "What else do we have?" Clara swallowed hard. "Nothing yet, sir. But the press is swarming outside, and the prosecutors demanding a meeting." Samuel dismissed her with a whim, his mind spiraling. He couldn't face the courtroom, not with Ezekiel's eyes haunting him. He needed answers how a hero had been abandoned, why justice had failed him. Grabbing his phone, he dialed Colonel Marcus Reed, a retired Whitler II officer who now led a veterans advocacy group. "Marcus, it's Sam," he said, his voice raw. "Ezekiel Hawthorne. He's here, in my courtroom. I need you." Marcus's sharp intake of breath crackled through the line. "Ezekiel. Good Lord. Sam, you're sure Marcus vowed to tap every veterans network to find anyone who knew Ezekiel's story?" As Samuel hung up, a fire ignited in his chest. He couldn't erase the years of neglect, but he could damn well fight for Ezekiel now. In the holding cell, Ezekiel sat on a metal bench, wrists still cuffed, his medals glinting faintly in the dim light. A young guard, having overheard the courtroom's uproar, approached, his voice hesitant. "Sir, is it true you saved all those men?" Ezekiel's gaze lifted, and a flicker of a smile crossed his lips, weathered but unbroken. "I did my duty," he said, his words a quiet thunder, carrying the weight of a life forged in sacrifice. The guard stepped back, his posture shifting to one of reverence. Outside, the courthouse steps. 9 steps buzzed with a growing crowd, reporters, locals, even a few veterans drawn by whispers of the story. Lena Hayes, the tenacious reporter, filed her first dispatch, her words racing across social media. "Forgotten Wabwachwit, hero in chains, a Medal of Honor. Recipient, faces injustice." By dusk, Ezekiel's name was a wildfire, spreading far beyond the small town, igniting outrage and awe in equal measure. The Virginia courthouse, usually a sleepy hub of minor disputes, had transformed into a crucible of chaos by midday, its steps swarming with reporters, their cameras flashing like gunfire, and locals clutching phones, whispering Ezekiel James Hawthorne's name as if it were a prayer or a curse. Inside, Clara, the young clerk, hunched over her laptop in a cramped office, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she scoured military archives, driven by a mix of duty and disbelief. Ezekiel's service record glowed on her screen, a litany of commendations, a Distinguished Service Cross, a Purple Heart, and the Medal of Honor, awarded for conspicuous gallantry in Normandy, 1904. The citation detailed how Sergeant Hawthorne, under relentless enemy fire, saved 12 American soldiers, navigating a kill zone with wounds of his own. Yet the record ended abruptly with his 1945 discharge, a black hole swallowing the decades that led to his arrest. Clara's stomach churned. How had a hero fallen so far? She printed the documents, her hands shaking, and rushed to Judge Carter's chambers, where Samuel sat staring at the shattered glass on his desk, his mind still tangled in Normandy's ghosts. "Sir, you need to see this," Clara said, thrusting the papers forward. Samuel's eyes scanned the citation, each word a dagger of guilt. He'd survived because of Ezekiel, yet he'd done nothing to honor him. "Find more," he ordered, his voice low but urgent. "There has to be something: veterans' records, hospital files, anything." Clara nodded, returning to her search, while Samuel's phone buzzed with a call from Colonel Marcus Reed. "Sam, I've got something," Marcus said, his voice taut. He'd reached out to a network of WIT2 veterans, and one, a retired captain named Henry Walsh, claimed to have served with Ezekiel in the final months of the war. Walsh was frail, living in a nursing home in Richmond, but willing to talk. "I'm driving there now," Marcus said. "I'll call you tonight." Samuel hung up, a flicker of hope battling the shame in his chest. Outside, Lena Hayes, the reporter, stood on the courthouse lawn, her phone live streaming to thousands as she recounted Ezekiel's story, her voice sharp with indignation. A Medal of Honor recipient, homeless and handcuffed. While we argue about trespassing, she said, her words slicing through the digital ether. Her post from the previous night had gone viral, shared by veterans groups, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens, amassing over 1 million views. By noon, national outlets CNN, MSNBC, Fox had picked up the story, their vans clogging the town's narrow streets. Lena's editor demanded a deeper dive, so she tracked down a lead, a local veterans shelter where Ezekiel had occasionally stayed. At the shelter, a grizzled manager named Tom, himself a Vietnam vet, recognized Ezekiel's name instantly. He never talked much. Tom told Lena, his voice heavy, came in for a meal, maybe a cot, always wearing that old uniform. Said it kept him grounded. I figured he was just another guy the system chewed up. Tom's eyes darkened as he added, but those medals, I knew they meant something. I just didn't know how much. Lena scribbled notes, her mind racing. She asked about Ezekiel's life, where he'd been, what he'd done, but Tom shook his head. He kept to himself, never asked for help. Last I saw him was a month ago, sleeping on a bench near the park. Lena thanked him and headed back to the courthouse, determined to find someone who knew Ezekiel's story. Meanwhile, Clara's search yielded a breakthrough, a 1950s VA hospital record mentioning Ezekiel's treatment for shrapnel wounds and battle fatigue, an early term for PTSD. The file noted his discharge from care with no follow-up, a common fate for Black veterans in a segregated system. Clara's heart sank as she uncovered more, a 1970s arrest for vagrancy, dismissed but a stain nonetheless, and a 1990s application for veterans benefits, rejected for insufficient documentation. She compiled the findings, each page a testament to a system that had failed a hero. Back in the holding cell, Ezekiel sat motionless, his cuffed hands resting on his knees, his medals catching the faint light. The young guard, now a regular visitor, slipped him a bottle of water. "People are talking about you out there," the guard said, his voice tinged with awe. "They're saying you're a hero." Ezekiel's gaze remained steady, his voice soft but firm. "I ain't no hero, just a soldier who did his job." The guard hesitated, then asked, "Why didn't you tell anyone about the medals?" The wart Ezekiel's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Who'd listen? The words hung heavy, a truth sharper than the cuffs on his wrists. By evening, Marcus arrived at the Richmond nursing home, where Henry Walsh sat in a wheelchair, his eyes cloudy but his memory sharp. Ezekiel was a rock. Walsh said, his voice quavering. After Normandy, he trained new recruits, kept us steady. But when the war ended, they sent him home to nothing, no support. Last I heard, he was in Chicago, working odd jobs. Then he just disappeared. Marcus pressed for more, but Walsh's strength faded. "Find him." "Marcus," Walsh whispered. "He deserves better." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight, and called Samuel with the update. As night fell, the courthouse glowed under the glare of news cameras. The story of Ezekiel James Hawthorne, now a national firestorm, Lena's latest report, detailing the VA's failures, trended online, sparking hashtags like #Justice for Ezekiel. In his chambers, Samuel read Clara's findings, each page fueling his resolve. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for Ezekiel's future. The investigation was only beginning, and the truth, like Ezekiel's medals, was starting to shine through the cracks of a broken system. The Virginia courthouse, once a quiet relic of small-town justice, had become a battleground. Its steps choked with a swelling crowd, reporters shouting questions, veterans in faded caps chanting for justice, and locals waving handwritten signs that read "Free Ezekiel and honor our hero." By dawn, Ezekiel James Hawthorne's story had erupted into a national firestorm, fueled by Lena Hayes' viral reports, which now racked up millions of views across platforms. Her latest post, a searing expose of the VA's neglect, had sparked a #Justice for Ezekiel that trended worldwide, shared by celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens outraged that a Medal of Honor recipient languished in a cell for trespassing. The air buzzed with fury, a collective reckoning that shook the town's sleepy streets. News vans from every major outlet lined the block, their satellite dishes looming like sentinels, while social media platforms pulsed with clips of Ezekiel's courtroom entrance. His tattered uniform and gleaming medals, a stark contrast to the handcuffs binding. Inside the courthouse, Judge Samuel Carter stood at his chamber's window, watching the crowd swell. His stomach knotted with guilt and resolve. Clara, his clerk, burst in, her face flushed, clutching a stack of printouts. "Sir, the governor's office called," she said, breathless. "They're monitoring the situation, and the police chief wants to meet." Samuel nodded, barely listening, his eyes fixed on a veteran in the crowd, an old man with a silver star pinned to his jacket, saluting toward the courthouse. The gesture felt like a rebuke, a reminder of the debt owed to Ezekiel. Outside, Lena faced a sea of cameras, her voice steady but fierce. "This isn't just about one man," she declared, her live stream drawing thousands in real time. "It's about a system that discards its heroes, that lets a man who saved lives sleep on the streets." Her words struck a nerve, and within hours, protests sprang up in cities from Atlanta to Chicago, veterans and activists marching with signs demanding accountability. The local police department, caught in the crosshairs, issued a defensive statement, claiming Ezekiel's arrest followed standard protocol, but it only poured fuel on the fire. Social media erupted with photos of the arresting officers, their names and badge numbers circulating alongside calls for their suspension. The town's police chief, a burly man named Harold Vance, faced a barrage of reporters on the courthouse steps, his face red as he stammered through an apology. "We had no knowledge of Mr. Hawthorne's service record," he said, but the crowd jeered, drowning him out with chants of shame. A young woman in the crowd, a college student named Aisha, live-streamed the scene, her voice trembling with anger. "They cuffed a war hero like he was nothing," she said, her video amassing 500,000 views by noon. The outrage wasn't just digital outside the police station. A group of veterans unfurled a banner reading, "Respect our vets," their faces grim but determined. Inside the holding cell, Ezekiel sat quietly, his cuffed hands folded, his medals catching the dim light. The young guard, now a regular visitor, slipped him a sandwich, his eyes darting nervously. "It's crazy out there." "Sir," he said, "people are fighting for you." "Oh." Ezekiel nodded, his expression unreadable. "They shouldn't have to," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the guard. The words lingered, a quiet indictment of a world that had forgotten him. Back at the courthouse, Clara's research uncovered more fragments of Ezekiel's past: a 1960s eviction notice from a Chicago tenement, a 1980s hospital stay for untreated PTSD, and a 2000s letter to the VA, pleading for benefits, stamped denied. Each document was a wound, proof of a system that had turned its back on a hero. Samuel read the files, his jaw tight, and called Colonel Marcus Reed for an update. Marcus, still in Richmond, had spoken to more veterans, piecing together Ezekiel's post-war life odd jobs as a janitor, mechanic, and farmhand, always moving, never settling, haunted by memories of war and the sting of a country that offered him no place. He deserved better. "Sam," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "We all did." Samuel hung up, his resolve hardening. He drafted a motion to expedite Ezekiel's case, demanding a full review of the charges. Outside, the protest grew louder, the crowd now numbering in the hundreds, their voices a relentless drumbeat. Aisha's live stream captured a pivotal moment. An elderly black veteran, leaning on a cane, stepped forward to speak. "I served in Korea," he said, his voice booming. "We fought for this country, and it spat on us. Ezekiel's story is our story." The crowd roared, and the video spread like wildfire, drawing thousands more to the cause. By evening, the governor tweeted a statement promising an investigation into Ezekiel's treatment and systemic failures in veterans' care. The announcement, meant to quell the unrest, only amplified it as activists demanded action, not words. Lena's next report, broadcast live on CNN, detailed Ezekiel's Medal of Honor citation, her voice breaking as she read his acts of valor. The segment ended with a call to action. If you believe in justice, show up. And people did. Veterans drove overnight from neighboring states. Families brought flowers to the courthouse, and a local church organized a vigil, their candles flickering against the dusk. In the case, a small but significant act unfolded. A group of high school students launched an online fundraiser for Ezekiel, raising $10,000 in hours to cover legal fees and housing. The fund's page, adorned with a photo of Ezekiel's medals, spread across social media, a beacon of hope amid the anger. As night fell, Samuel stood alone in his chambers, the crowd's chants echoing through the walls. He looked at the photo of his Normandy squad, Ezekiel's absence a gaping wound. The outrage outside was a mirror of his own, a demand for redemption. Ezekiel's truth was no longer buried, and the world was finally listening. The Virginia courthouse, now a beacon of reckoning, pulsed with a restless energy as dawn broke. Its lawn transformed into a sea of faces, veterans gripping faded flags, families clutching candles, and students hoisting signs that read, "Honor Ezekiel," while Ezekiel James Hawthorne's story, once buried in the shadows of neglect, had ignited a movement. Its flames fanned by Lena Hayes' relentless reporting and the viral fury of #JusticeForEzekiel. The crowd, now thousands strong, spilled onto the surrounding streets, their chants a steady heartbeat demanding redemption for a hero. Inside his chambers, Judge Samuel Carter watched the scene unfold, his heart heavy with a mix of awe and shame. The world was rallying for Ezekiel, but he knew the fight was far from over. Clara, his clerk, rushed in, her eyes bright with urgency. "Sir, you won't believe this," she said, holding up her phone. A crowdfunding page, started by local high school students, had raised $50,000 overnight for Ezekiel's legal fees, housing, and medical care. By mid-morning, donations from across the country pushed the total past 200,000, with over 3,000 contributors leaving messages of gratitude. "Thank you for your sacrifice. You're not forgotten. We owe you everything." Samuel's throat tightened as he scrolled through the comments, each one a brick in the foundation of Ezekiel's new beginning. Outside, a new wave of support emerged as the families of the 12 soldiers Ezekiel saved in Normandy began to arrive. Margaret Thompson, a retired nurse whose father was one of the rescued, stood before the crowd, her voice trembling but clear. "My dad told me about Sergeant Hawthorne," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He said that man was a miracle, carrying him through hell. I'm here to say thank you." Her words, broadcast live by Lena, struck a chord, and soon descendants of the other soldiers' grandchildren, nieces, nephews joined her, their presence a living testament to Ezekiel's valor. A veterans organization, led by Colonel Marcus Reed, announced a national campaign called Homes for Heroes, aimed at housing homeless veterans, with Ezekiel as its first recipient. Marcus, fresh from his Richmond interviews, took the courthouse steps, his voice booming through a megaphone. "Ezekiel Hawthorne is not just a man, he's a symbol of every veteran we've failed," he said, his words met with roars of approval. The campaign's website crashed within hours, overwhelmed by donations and volunteers. Local businesses joined the effort, offering free meals, clothing, and medical services for Ezekiel, while a Richmond law firm pledged pro bono representation to ensure his charges were dropped. In the holding cell, Ezekiel sat quietly, his cuffed hands resting on his knees, his medals glinting in the dim light. The young guard, now a familiar face, slipped him a newspaper, its headline screaming, "Nation Rallies for Forgotten Hero." Ezekiel glanced at it, then set it aside, his expression unreadable. "All this fuss," he murmured, his voice low but steady. "I just did my job." The guard, emboldened by Ezekiel's calm, pressed further. "Sir, don't you want this? The house, the support." Ezekiel's eyes met his, a flicker of weariness beneath their resolve. "I wanted it 50 years ago," he said, the words a quiet thunder, revealing the depth of his endurance. The guard fell silent, struck by the weight of a life spent in the margins. Outside, the community's efforts gained in momentum. A local church organized a 24-hour vigil, its members singing hymns and lighting candles that glowed against the night sky. Aisha, the college student whose live stream had galvanized thousands, partnered with the high school students to expand the fundraiser, setting a new goal of $500,000 to establish a veterans shelter in Ezekiel's name. By evening, the total hit $300,000, with donations pouring in from as far as California and New York. Lena's latest report, aired on national television, showcased the growing movement, her voice thick with emotion as she interviewed Margaret and other descendants. "This is what happens when a nation wakes up," she said, her words echoing across living rooms and social media feeds. The segment ended with a video message from a senator, pledging to introduce legislation to improve veterans' care, citing Ezekiel's story as a call to action. Back in the courthouse, Clara uncovered more of Ezekiel's past, a 1970s letter from a Chicago pastor, praising Ezekiel for volunteering at a soup kitchen despite his own poverty, and a 1990s note from a fellow veteran, thanking him for helping secure a job. Each fragment painted a picture of a man who, despite being abandoned, never stopped giving. Samuel read the documents, his resolve deepening. He met with the pro bono lawyers, who were building a case to dismiss Ezekiel's charges and sue the city for wrongful arrest. The lawyers, led by a fierce advocate named Rachel Kim, argued that Ezekiel's treatment violated federal protections for veterans. "We're not just fighting for him," Rachel told Samuel. "We're fighting for every vet like him." As night fell, the courthouse lawn glowed with candlelight, the crowd now a tapestry of faces young and old, black and white, veteran and civilian united by a shared purpose. Aisha took the stage, her voice steady. "Ezekiel Hawthorne didn't just save 12 men," she said. "He's saving us all, showing us what we can do when we stand together." The crowd erupted, their cheers carrying into the night. In his chambers, Samuel looked out at the sea of lights, his heart swelling with a fragile hope. The community had rallied, not just for Ezekiel, but for a truth long ignored. The fight for justice was gaining ground, and Ezekiel's legacy was becoming a beacon for change. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, every seat filled, every breath heavy with anticipation as Ezekiel James Hawthorne's case surged toward a reckoning. Judge Samuel Carter gripped the bench, his knuckles white, as Rachel Kim, the pro bono lawyer leading Ezekiel's defense, paced before him, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "This is not a trespassing case," she declared, her voice slicing through the tense air. "This is a case about a nation's failure to honor its heroes." She presented a motion to dismiss the charge, arguing that Ezekiel's status as a Medal of Honor recipient and protected veteran rendered the arrest unlawful. The gallery, packed with veterans and supporters, leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Rachel's evidence was a battering ram. Clara's research, a damning chronicle of systemic neglect, detailed the VA's 1990s denial of Ezekiel's benefits, a 1970s vagrancy arrest dismissed but never expunged, and a 1980s hospital record noting untreated PTSD, each a link in a chain of abandonment. She introduced affidavits from veterans who'd known Ezekiel, testifying to his selflessness, and a statement from Colonel Marcus Reed, who traced Ezekiel's post-war life, decades of odd jobs, evictions, and discrimination that left him homeless, but never broken. The prosecutor, David Wells, a wiry man with sweat beading on his forehead, countered weakly, insisting the trespassing charge was procedurally valid based on Ezekiel's presence on public property after hours. Rachel dismantled his argument with surgical precision, holding up Ezekiel's Medal of Honor citation. This man saved 12 lives, including Judge Carter's, under enemy fire, she said, her voice rising. And we repay him with handcuffs, the gallery erupted, forcing the bailiff to pound his gavel for order. Samuel's gaze flickered to Ezekiel, seated at the defendant's table, his tattered uniform and medals a silent rebuke to the room. Rachel's team escalated the fight, filing a federal lawsuit against the city for wrongful arrest and civil rights violations, citing the VA's failures as evidence of systemic bias. The bombshell came mid-hearing a leaked 1980s VA memo, uncovered by Clara, admitting to disparities in benefits for Black veterans, directly impacting Ezekiel's claims. Rachel read the memo aloud, her voice steady but searing, and gasps rippled through the courtroom. Wells, visibly shaken, stammered an objection, but Samuel overruled him, his face grim. The memo shifted the case's momentum, forcing Wells to request a recess to reassess. Rachel pressed her advantage, calling an expert witness, Dr. Elena Martinez, a PTSD specialist, who testified that Ezekiel's trespassing was a symptom of trauma, a need for familiar spaces to feel safe. This wasn't a crime, Martinez said. It was a cry for help the system ignored. The testimony landed like a grenade, and even Wells's cross-examination faltered. His questions met with Martinez's unflinching expertise. The lawsuit gained traction as Rachel's team subpoenaed the arresting officer's body cam footage, which showed Ezekiel being shoved into a patrol car, his medals ignored, his arm twisted despite his compliance. The footage, played in court, drew murmurs from the gallery, its grainy images a stark contrast to Ezekiel's dignified silence. Rachel argued the arrest violated federal protections under the Veterans Benefits Act, demanding not only dismissal but damages for emotional distress. The city's lawyers, a slick team led by a corporate attorney named Gregory Holt, pushed back, warning that a ruling in Ezekiel's favor would open a floodgate of litigation. Rachel didn't flinch. Then let the flood come, she said, her voice ablade. It's time to clean house. The hearing stretched into the afternoon, with Wells conceding that the trespassing charge could be reduced to a fine. But Rachel rejected the offer, insisting on full dismissal and an apology. Samuel, his voice steady but heavy, scheduled a follow-up hearing, signaling his intent to rule decisively. As the session adjourned, he met Ezekiel in a private room, the first time they had spoken since Normandy. I failed you, Samuel said, his eyes wet. Ezekiel's gaze was soft but firm. You're here now, he said, his words a balm and a challenge. Rachel's team, meanwhile, uncovered a new lead, a 2000s VA audit revealing thousands of denied claims from minority veterans, bolstering their lawsuit. The evidence, presented to Samuel, strengthened their case, but Holt's team hinted at a settlement to avoid a public trial. Rachel refused, determined to expose the system's rot. In the holding cell, Ezekiel sat quietly, his cuffed hands folded, his medals glinting faintly. The young guard, now a quiet advocate, brought him a letter from Margaret Thompson, whose father Ezekiel saved. You gave me my dad. It read, now we're giving you your life back. Ezekiel read it, his expression unreadable, then tucked it into his uniform. A rare gesture of acceptance. The legal battle was nearing its climax, with the nation watching. The gallery's energy, a pulse of hope. Rachel's closing argument echoed in Samuel's mind. Justice delayed is justice denied. Let's not delay any longer. The case was no longer just about Ezekiel. It was a verdict on a country's soul. The courtroom doors swung open, and a reverent hush fell over the packed gallery as Ezekiel James Hawthorne stepped inside, his wrists free of handcuffs for the first time in weeks, his tattered WPU uniform still adorned with medals that gleamed under the lights, each one a testament to a courage that had reshaped a nation's conscience. The final hearing had arrived, and the air crackled with anticipation. Every seat filled with veterans, activists, descendants of the soldiers Ezekiel saved, and reporters whose pens hovered, ready to capture a moment that felt like history unfolding. Judge Samuel Carter took the bench, his face etched with resolve, his eyes lingering on Ezekiel, who sat at the defendant's table, his posture straight, his gaze steady but soft, as if he carried the weight of the world yet refused to bend. Rachel Kim, Ezekiel's fierce lawyer, stood ready, her briefcase stuffed with evidence that had turned a trespassing charge into a national reckoning. The gallery buzzed faintly, but Samuel's gavel brought silence, its sharp crack a signal that justice was at hand. Rachel opened with a motion to dismiss the charge, her voice clear and commanding. "Ezekiel Hawthorne is not a criminal," she said, holding up his Medal of Honor citation. "He is a hero abandoned by the system he served." The evidence is undeniable: decades of VA neglect, discriminatory policies, and an arrest that violated his rights. She presented the 1980s VA memo admitting disparities in benefits for Black veterans, the body cam footage showing Ezekiel's rough treatment, and Dr. Martinez's testimony linking his actions to untreated PTSD. Each piece was a hammer, dismantling the prosecution's case. David Wells, the prosecutor, rose, his face pale, his earlier confidence eroded by weeks of public outrage. He offered a tepid defense, suggesting a reduced fine, but his words faltered under the gallery's glare and Rachel's swift rebuttal. "A fine is not justice," she snapped. "Dismissal and accountability are." She introduced a new exhibit, a 2000s VA audit revealing thousands of denied claims from minority veterans, with Ezekiel's case as a glaring example. The gallery gasped, and Wells sank into his seat, his objections silenced. Samuel listened intently, his notes sprawling across his desk, his mind replaying Ezekiel's words from their private meeting. "You're doing right now." The weight of that forgiveness drove him now. Rachel's closing argument was a masterpiece, her voice rising with passion. "This court has a chance to right a wrong, to honor a man who saved lives, including yours, Your Honor. Let's not fail him again." The gallery erupted in applause, veterans standing, their cheers a thunder that shook the room. Samuel called for order, but his own eyes glistened, the memory of Normandy vivid: Ezekiel dragging him through gunfire, his strength a lifeline. The city's lawyers, led by Gregory Holt, made a final plea, warning of legal case if the charge was dismissed and the lawsuit upheld. Rachel countered with a single sentence: "Chaos is what Ezekiel endured for decades while we looked away." The room fell silent, her words a verdict in themselves. Samuel adjourned briefly, retreating to his chambers to draft his ruling, his hands steady but his heart racing. He returned an hour later, the courtroom holding its breath. In the matter of Ezekiel James Hawthorne, he began, his voice firm: "The charge of trespassing is dismissed with prejudice." The gallery roared, hats tossed into the air, tears streaming down faces. Samuel continued, his tone grave. "Furthermore, this court finds sufficient evidence to support the plaintiff's lawsuit against the city for wrongful arrest and systemic neglect. The case will proceed to trial." Rachel nodded, her eyes fierce, while Holt's team slumped, defeated. Samuel turned to Ezekiel, his voice softening. "Sergeant Hawthorne, this court apologizes for the indignity you've suffered. Your service will not be forgotten again." Ezekiel stood, his medals clinking softly, and nodded, his expression calm but profound. A man who'd carried too much for too long. The gallery rose as one, their applause a rolling wave that lasted minutes. Veterans saluting, activists weeping, and Margaret Thompson, whose father Ezekiel saved, clutching a photo of her dad, her sobs mingling with pride. Ezekiel spoke briefly, his voice low but resonant. "I didn't fight for me," he said. "I fought for them, my brothers, my country. Thank you for remembering." His words, simple yet seismic, silenced the room, a reminder of a sacrifice that transcended time. Outside, Lena Hayes live-streamed the ruling, her voice breaking as she described the scene, her report reaching millions. The crowd, now numbering in the thousands, cheered, their signs of justice for Ezekiel held high. Aisha, the student activist, took the microphone, her voice soaring. "This is for every veteran who's been forgotten," she said. "We won't stop here." The fundraising campaign, now at $600,000, secured a permanent home for Ezekiel, with plans for a veterans shelter in his name. Rachel's team prepared for the federal lawsuit, bolstered by new evidence testimonies from other homeless veterans, echoing Ezekiel's struggles. The city, under pressure, offered a settlement, but Rachel rejected it, determined to expose systemic failures in open court. Samuel left the bench, pausing to shake Ezekiel's hand, their grip a bridge across decades. "You've given us a chance to be better," Samuel said. Ezekiel's faint smile was enough. As Ezekiel stepped outside, the crowd parted, their applause a corridor of honor, cameras flashing, children waving flags. He raised a hand, not in triumph but in gratitude, his medals shining against the setting sun. The hearing was over, but the fight for justice in Ezekiel's legacy was just beginning. Ezekiel James Hawthorne stood on the steps of the Virginia courthouse, the spring sun warming his weathered face, his Wubby uniform still tattered, but his medals gleaming like stars against the faded olive fabric, each one a chapter of a life that had finally been seen. The crowd, a tapestry of thousands of veterans, families, students, and strangers united by his story, parted silently, their eyes fixed on him, their hands raised in salute or clutching flowers, a sea of gratitude for a man who'd once been invisible. Weeks had passed since the final hearing, and Ezekiel was no longer a defendant but a symbol, his name etched into a nation's awakening. The trespassing charge was gone, dismissed with an apology that echoed from the courtroom to the headlines, and the federal lawsuit against the city, led by Rachel Kim, had secured a landmark settlement, $2 million for Ezekiel's care and a mandate for veteran housing reforms. The money funded a modest home in Richmond, a place with a garden where Ezekiel could sit in peace, and a medical trust for his health, ensuring the scars of war and neglect would no longer define him. The crowdfunding campaign, now at $1.2 million, had birthed the Ezekiel Hawthorne Veterans Shelter, a haven for homeless veterans, its groundbreaking ceremony drawing thousands, including Aisha, whose activism had fueled the movement. Ezekiel cut the ribbon, his hand steady, his voice soft but clear. "This ain't for me," he said, gesturing to the shelter. "It's for my brothers who never made it home." The crowd roared, their applause a hymn of redemption, and Lena Hayes, live streaming the event, wept openly, her report reaching millions. The shelter's walls bore a plaque with Ezekiel's Medal of Honor citation, a reminder of a sacrifice that had sparked change. Judge Samuel Carter stood among the crowd, his eyes on Ezekiel, his heart lighter than it had been in decades. He'd resigned from the bench weeks earlier, citing a need to serve justice beyond the gavel, and now worked with Colonel Marcus Reed's Homes for Heroes campaign, advocating for veterans' rights. Samuel had visited Ezekiel's new home, bringing a photo of their Normandy squad, Ezekiel's absence in the frame, a wound now healed by their reunion. "You gave me a life," Samuel told him, his voice thick. Ezekiel's reply was simple. "You gave me one back." The exchange, overheard by Margaret Thompson, whose father Ezekiel saved, became a mantra for the movement, repeated in rallies and news segments. Margaret, now a regular visitor, brought Ezekiel letters from the descendants of the 12 soldiers, each one a thread tying him to a past he'd never sought to claim. The nation's response continued to grow. A senator's bill, inspired by Ezekiel's story, passed with bipartisan support, allocating funds for veteran mental health and housing, while the VA launched an internal review of denied claims. Spurred by the 1980s memo Rachel's team had uncovered, Ezekiel's story had become a catalyst, Its ripples felt in policy changes and community initiatives, from local food drives to national advocacy groups. Yet Ezekiel remained unchanged, his humility a quiet force. He spent mornings in his garden, tending to roses, and afternoons at the shelter, listening to veterans' stories. His presence a comfort stronger than words. One evening, a young veteran, scarred by a rock, sat with him, his voice breaking. "How'd you keep going?" he asked. Ezekiel's eyes, weathered but kind, met his. "You keep going for the ones beside you," he said, his words a lifeline, just as they'd been in Normandy. The shelter's staff, trained in PTSD care, adopted Ezekiel's approach, creating a model that spread to other cities. Lena's final report, aired on a primetime special, traced Ezekiel's journey from a cell to a home, her voice steady but emotional. "This is what happens when we choose to see," she said, ending with a call to honor all veterans. The segment won awards, but Lena credited Ezekiel, visiting him to share the news. "You're the story," she told him. He shook his head, pointing to the shelter. They are, Months later, a small monument was unveiled in the town square, a bronze statue of a soldier carrying a wounded comrade, its plaque reading, "For Ezekiel Hawthorne and all who serve." Ezekiel attended the ceremony, leaning on a cane, his medals pinned to a new jacket. The crowd, smaller but no less devoted, stood in silence as he spoke. "I ain't special," he said, "but you've made me feel like I am. Thank you." His words, carried by the wind, felt like a blessing, and the crowd wept, their hands over their hearts. Ezekiel returned to his garden that evening, the sunset painting the sky in hues of gold, his roses blooming in defiance of time. He was no longer a man in chains, but a beacon of resilience, his life a testament to the power of truth and community. The nation had bowed to his sacrifice, and Ezekiel, at last, had found peace. From a hero's arrest to nationwide honor, this soldier's tale shook the system. Thank you for listening. Like, share, and subscribe to never miss a story. Hit the bell for our latest videos and join us in celebrating courage and justice.